اینجا ما برای یه لکچر استاد پروفسور سید امیر حسین عابدی جمع شده ایم. من از طرف سوسایتی همه را خیر مقدم میگم که خوش اومدین اینجا تشریف آوردین. همینطور برای مهمان نوازی خانه فرهنگ را ممنون و مشکور هستیم که اینها برای این مصاحبه جا دادن. من با اجازه صدر جلسه این را شروع می کنم. Professor Sayyid Amir Hassan Abidi Memorial Lecture by Era Mukhote. And all the lectures of 9th series are there on YouTube, so you can visit and watch those. Now I will not take much time, but this share of Iqbal is very much related to the Professor Abidi. हजारों साल नरगिस अपनी बेनूरी पे रोती है, हजारों साल नरगिस अपनी बेनूरी पे रोती है, बड़ी मुश्किल से होता है चमन में दीदवर पैदा. बस उस्ताद प्रोफेसर सैयद अमीर हसन आबिदी हम यकी از اون دیدواران بودند که توی این جمعیت هند اومدن و فارسی را زنده کردند و فقط فارسی نه، فرهنگ هند را در کتاب فارسی دوباره احیا کردند. من از استاد Now I request Professor Chandrasekhar, Vice President of the Society, to introduce our distinguished guest on the dais, also as well as to speak about the legacy of Professor Sayyid Amir Hassan Abidi and his enduring impact on Indo-Persian studies. الان من استاد فریخته پروفسور چندرشیخر که استاد تقریبا همه دانشجویان که اینجا نشسته‌اند هستند، من از استاد تقاضا میکنم که اونها درباره اون مهمانان که اینجا تشریف دارند حرفی یه مختصرا تعارفی بدن و همینطور درباره مصاحبه امروز حرف بزنن. الان استاد.
Assalamu alaikum. Good evening to everyone. I know our respected cultural counselor, Mr. Farid Asr, knows English very well. In between, I will speak in Persian also for Dr. Kerman Suleimani and others to take lesser time and speak in two languages. This is the 10th lecture, and we are fortunate that without any break we are having these lectures. And all the laborious work is being done by Sohail, continuously following it with Madam Bilkis and Madam Rana Safi, and bringing scholars from the various fields. As our own revered teacher, Professor Abidi, if you look at his works, it is not confined only to the Persian literature. From music to Indian philosophy, like translation of Katha Sarit Sagar, Darya Asmar, which he worked with late Dr. Tarak Chand at Tehran and published then, or the other works which he did. The most important factor about Sarabdi is that it is not the self-elevation for himself. If he is going to any library, suppose I was his last PhD student, he was in Istanbul Topkapi Saray Museum, and I was working on Masnavis of Amir Khusro. He came back and brought Farasnama, which was only one manuscript which is available. He copied the whole manuscript there. At that time, microfilming and all these things were not allowed. He copied the whole manuscript and brought it and said, see, this is another work which is not available. So this kind of the contribution and encouragement for the students and the scholars he was providing. Even if 2 lines for any student, he knew that he is working on such and such topic, he will bring and he will give it. Only 2 days back I was looking at again the translation of Taj al-Masir. The whole text he edited, it is in his own handwriting, and on the basis of that Dr. Bhagat Swarup translated into English. Fortunately I have both the handwritten one, and we are trying to bring out bilingual through Manohar Taj al-Masir, the Persian text and the English text. Main thing is that looking at his writings, he used to write, suppose, hardly 100 words on a page. We used to write 250, 200. So that kind of generosity one can see from the writing also. We are trying to do or the redoing his works on and off, especially Madam Bilkis has published most of his works in fact, and a good number of his works have been put up, uploaded on the website also. So as I said, we are not confining only to the Persian literature, and on the variety of the subjects scholars are being invited. And today's is also an example that away from the domain of Persian literature, I am happy that Professor Ira accepted this, and definitely we all will be benefited from it. First of all, we are thankful to Honorable Mr. Farid and Dr. Kairwan Soleimani. Continuously they are allowing us to have this lecture from this hall. Before coming here, I was with Dr. Soleimani and discussing about the legacy of Professor Abidi. That if we are standing with him, he will not say that my student or my PhD scholar is standing with me. He will introduce. He is also co-teacher with me. And when we used to say, sir, we are your students. So he used to say, if I will not raise your dignity, no one will do it. So this kind of a encouragement, and as and when we will meet him, he will just ask, what are you doing? Means what new you have done, nothing else, not about the family. So we are fortunate, we are trained by him in the variety of the subjects, of which primary sources are Persian. I am happy Dr. Kairwan Soleimani, who has been also the host of Professor Abdi number of times in Tehran, and continuing bringing out variety of the works in Persian and encouraging students through various workshops to do research works, taking up new texts for the editing, so that at least at some level we can do for the Persian literature or the Persian sources. Professor Ira, if I am not correct, please do correct me about the pronunciation. Ira Mokhote, an astute author and historian, pens masterful works of narrative history, writing in English. She is the author of critically acclaimed works which aims to reclaim the voices of women that were erased from the tapestry of Indian history. From Draupadi to Radha, 6 real women who played extraordinary roles, but who were not written into textbooks as were their male counterparts, including Jahan Ara Begum, Rani Lakshmibai, and Hazrat Mahal. I hope from Bhopal also the renowned lady Shahjani Begum would have been also taken care of. Her second book, Daughters of the Sun, Empresses, Queens and Begums of the Mughal Empire, which was about the disappeared women of the great Mughals, was published in 2018. In 2020, she published Akbar, the Great Mughal, which a reviewer in the Asian Review of Books described as an ambitious work crafted with great imagination about how the past and the present intersect. Her novel Song of Draupadi was published. The book reimagines Mahabharata through the narration of its women characters, particularly Draupadi. In 2024, she published The Lion and the Lily, The Rise and Fall of Awadh, which follows the rise and fall of Awadh, an important Mughal Suba, which gained relative. Today's her lecture will highlight mostly the Awadh. We are happy to have Professor Farhad Hassan. Though among many he does not need any introduction, but for others also I should read. He is a professor of medieval and early modern South Asian history at University of Delhi. He has written 2 books or many papers and delivered many lectures. Paper Performance in the State, Social Change and the Political Culture in Mughal India, which explores the changing socio-cultural world in early modern South Asia and locates the agency of the Mughal state therein. The development of literacy and new forms of engagement between literacy and performance prompted the opening up of the new spaces of social communication and led to the development of performative and public sphere in South Asia. An earlier book, State and Locality in Mughal India, Power Relations in Western India, from 1572 to 1730, both published by Cambridge University Press. He has a number of academic papers, reviews and newspaper articles to his credit. He was elected president for the Medieval Indian section of the Indian History Congress 80th session at Kannur, Kerala. He was also a member of the editorial board of the journal Modern Asian Studies, Cambridge University Press. Professor Hassan was appointed as visiting fellow at the Master of Science, the Home Paris, from October to November 2006. Apart from all these, I know that he is working on another type of a project from Australia on the history of medicinal science. That is more important. He had a very good conference recently held at IAC, I believe, and good number of scholars had come over there. Sir, this was given to me, I read it. Whatever I know, that is much more than this.
No.
I'm not reading out there. Apart from these 2 distinguished guests, if I'm not wrong, we have Professor Ruqayya here, Dr. Rana Safi, our renowned teacher, Professor Bilkis Fatima Hossaini. Unfortunately, I am not introduced to the other lady sitting with. Oh,
She's my wife.
quick. I should have first introduced her.
More qualified than me.
Not at all.
In every male's case and in every male's success, there is a lady. And that's why we have this lecture on women. Many our scholars, young faculty members, and those especially family members of Professor Abdi by Javed and by Swair and Babi, etc. With this, I request, not taking much time, I not need to introduce myself, that's all, that I am student of Professor R. I request now, you please continue.
Thank you. Professor Sayyid Amir Hassan Abidi Memorial Lecture by Era Mukhote. And all the lectures of 9th series are there on YouTube, so you can visit and watch those. Now I will not take much time, but this share of Iqbal is very much related to the Professor Abidi. हजारों साल नरगिस अपनी बेनूरी पे रोती है, हजारों साल नरगिस अपनी बेनूरी पे रोती है, बड़ी मुश्किल से होता है चमन में दीदवर पैदा. बस उस्ताद प्रोफेसर सैयद अमीर हसन आबिदी हम यकी از اون دیدواران بودند که توی این جمعیت هند اومدن و فارسی را زنده کردند و فقط فارسی نه، فرهنگ هند را در کتاب فارسی دوباره احیا کردند. من از استاد Now I request Professor Chandrasekhar, Vice President of the Society, to introduce our distinguished guest on the dais, also as well as to speak about the legacy of Professor Sayyid Amir Hassan Abidi and his enduring impact on Indo-Persian studies. الان من استاد ما استاد فریخته پروفسور چندرشیخر که استاد تقریبا همه دانشجویان که اینجا نشسته‌اند هستند، من از استاد تقاضا میکنم که اونها درباره اون مهمانان که اینجا تشریف دارند حرفی یه مختصرا تعارفی بدن و همینطور درباره مصاحبه امروز حرف بزنن. الان استاد.
Assalamu alaikum. Good evening to everyone. I know our respected cultural counselor, Mr. Farid Asr, knows English very well. In between, I will speak in Persian also for Dr. Kerman Suleimani and others to take lesser time and speak in two languages. This is the 10th lecture, and we are fortunate that without any break we are having these lectures. And all the laborious work is being done by Sohail, continuously following it with Madam Bilkis and Madam Rana Safi, and bringing scholars from the various fields. As our own revered teacher, Professor Abidi, if you look at his works, it is not confined only to the Persian literature. From music to Indian philosophy, like translation of Katha Sarit Sagar, Darya Asmar, which he worked with late Dr. Tara Chand at Tehran and published then, or the other works which he did. The most important factor about Sarabdi is that it is not the self-elevation for himself. If he is going to any library, suppose I was his last PhD student, he was in Istanbul, Topkapi Saray Museum, and I was working on Masnavis of Amir Khusro. He came back and brought Farasnama, which was only one manuscript which is available. He copied the whole manuscript there. At that time, microfilming and all these things were not allowed. He copied the whole manuscript and brought it and said, see, this is another work which is not available. So this kind of the contribution and encouragement for the students and the scholars he was providing. Even if 2 lines for any student, he knew that he is working on such and such topic, he will bring and he will give it. Only 2 days back I was looking at again the translation of Taj al-Masir. The whole text he edited, it is in his own handwriting, and on the basis of that, Dr. Bhagat Swarup translated into English. Fortunately, I have both the handwritten one, and we are trying to bring out bilingual through Manohar, Taj al-Masir, the Persian text and the English text. Main thing is that looking at his writings, he used to write, suppose, hardly 100 words on a page. We used to write 250, 200. So that kind of generosity one can see from the writing also. We are trying to do or the redoing his works on and off, especially Madam Bilkis has published most of his works in fact, and a good number of his works have been uploaded on the website also. So as I said, we are not confining only to the Persian literature, and on the variety of the subjects scholars are being invited. And today's is also an example that away from the domain of Persian literature, I am happy that Professor Ira accepted this, and definitely we all will be benefited from it. First of all, we are thankful to Honorable Mr. Farid and Dr. Kairwan Soleimani. Continuously they are allowing us to have this lecture from this hall. Before coming here, I was with Dr. Soleimani and discussing about the legacy of Professor Abidi. That if we are standing with him, he will not say that my student or my PhD scholar is standing with me. He will introduce. He is also co-teacher with me. And when we used to say, sir, we are your students. So he used to say, if I will not raise your dignity, no one will do it. So this kind of a encouragement, and as and when we will meet him, he will just ask, what are you doing? Means what new you have done, nothing else, not about the family or anything. So we are fortunate, we are trained by him in the variety of the subjects, of which primary sources are Persian. I am happy Dr. Kairwan Soleimani, who has been also the host of Professor Abdi number of times in Tehran, and continuing bringing out variety of the works in Persian and encouraging students through various workshops to do research works, taking up new texts for the editing, so that at least at some level we can do for the Persian literature or the Persian sources. Professor Ira, if I am not correct, please do correct me about the pronunciation. Ira Mokhote, an astute author and historian, pens masterful works of narrative history, writing in English. She is the author of critically acclaimed works which aims to reclaim the voices of women that were erased from the tapestry of Indian history. From Draupadi to Radha, 6 real women who played extraordinary roles but who were not written into textbooks as were their male counterparts, including Jahan Ara Begum, Rani Lakshmibai and Hazrat Mahal. I hope from Bhopal also, the renowned lady Shahjani Begum would have been also taken care of. Her second book, Daughters of the Sun, Empresses, Queens and Begums of the Mughal Empire, which was about the disappeared women of the great Mughals, was published in 2018. In 2020, she published Akbar, the Great Mughal, which a reviewer in the Asian Review of Books described as an ambitious work crafted with great imagination about how the past and the present intersect. Her novel Song of Draupadi was published. The book reimagines Mahabharata through the narration of its women characters, particularly Draupadi. In 2024, she published The Lion and the Lily, The Rise and Fall of Awadh, which follows the rise and fall of Awadh, an important Mughal Suba, which gained relative. Today's her lecture will highlight mostly the Awadh. We are happy to have Professor Farhat Hasan. Though among many he does not need any introduction, but for others also I should read. He is a professor of medieval and early modern South Asian history at University of Delhi. He has written 2 books or many papers and delivered many lectures. Paper Performance in the State, Social Change in the Political Culture in Mughal India, which explores the changing socio-cultural world in early modern South Asia and locates the agency of the Mughal state therein. The development of literacy and new forms of engagement between literacy and performance prompted the opening up of the new spaces of social communication and led to the development of performative and public sphere in South Asia. An earlier book, State and Locality in Mughal India, Power Relations in Western India, from 1572 to 1730, both published by Cambridge University Press. He has a number of academic papers, reviews and newspaper articles to his credit. He was elected president for the Medieval Indian section of the Indian History Congress 80th session at Kannur, Kerala. He was also a member of the editorial board of the journal Modern Asian Studies, Cambridge University Press. Professor Hasan was appointed as visiting fellow at the Master of Science, the Home Paris, from October to November 2006. Apart from all these, I know that he is working on another type of a project from Australia on the history of medicinal science. That is more important. He had a very good conference recently held at IAC, I believe, and good number of scholars had come over there. Sir, this was given to me, I read it. Whatever I know, that is much more than this.
No.
I'm not reading out there. Apart from these 2 distinguished guests, if I'm not wrong, we have Professor Ruqayya here, Dr. Rana Safi, our renowned teacher, Professor Bilkis Fatima Hossaini. Unfortunately, I am not introduced to the other lady sitting with. Oh,
She's my wife.
quick. I should have first introduced her.
More qualified than me.
In every male's case and in every male's success, there is a lady. And that's why we have this lecture on women. Many our scholars, young faculty members, and those especially family members of Professor Abdi, by Javed and by Swair and Babi, etc. With this, I request, not taking much time, I not need to introduce myself. That's all, that I am a student of Professor Abdi. I request now, you please continue.
Thank you. ولی استاد کی هر چیزی اینجا گفتن برای ما یک سند هست. اینجا ما استاد رو داریم. استاد گفتن که خیلی کافی است که این استاد این دانشجوی استاد پروفسور عابدی هستند.
Thank you so much for having me here with you. Thank you to the Professor Abedi Memorial Committee for inviting me here today. It's a real honor, and I feel like a real interloper in this storied institution of Persian learning, Persian culture, to be speaking not about women, but about two men, and that two Firangi men. So please forgive me. The gist of my talk today is about two French men and the sort of archives that they have opened up to us. So, you know, one of my key searches when I write my stories, as it is for most historians, is to look for sources that help us understand our own history with a little more complexity and nuance that we normally do. The question of the 18th century, a lot of the archives and a lot of the information that we have sort of promoted the usual hegemony of the colonial narrative. For a long time we had that sort of story. And the colonial narrative in this case, since the British did finally win the colonial wars, it was the British narrative that we inherited. And though in recent times a lot of scholars have been pushing back against that easy narrative, there are scholars in gender studies, in subaltern studies, military biographies, all sorts of ways in which we have been able to push back against the narrative that we have been told for a long time. And you know, the importance of pushing back against those narratives is that we were handed down certain truths, such as in the 18th century, the Mughal Empire, the emperor, these were all in terminal decline. Nothing was happening, nothing dynamic was coming out of that encounter. We are also told that the so-called sub-imperial centers like Awadh, Murshidabad, Hyderabad, Mysore, nothing of great interest was happening because these rulers were great debauchees and frittering away all their money on unimportant things. And the art that was produced in the late 18th century, we were told for a long time, was really a very poor cousin of the great Mughal art under Shah Jahan. And now we know a lot of scholarly work has been done to question these kind of narratives, to tell us that actually a great deal of very exciting things were happening both in these so-called sub-imperial centers and in the art that was produced. And so to help give us a more granular and nuanced idea of what was happening in the 18th century, I thought it might be a good idea to look at the French sources, because though we have forgotten a lot about it today, both in France and in India, the French were actually important players in the 18th century, and there's a huge treasure trove of archives that are waiting there to be discovered. Scholars have begun working on this. You have Yuthika Sharma, Chanchan Dadlani, Dheer Sarangi, and Malini Roy especially, and others. But it is only the tip of the iceberg. I had a little bit of a side entrance into these archives because my mother, being French, had a very good sense to teach me French when I was growing up. So I read and write French, and that was a great advantage in being able to access some of these sources. So I'm really excited to share with you some of my findings, which did not find their way into my book because of pragmatic reasons. There's only so much you can actually use in a book of narrative history. But I'm very excited to show you some of these sources, some of these images, some of which have never been published before. Many have not been translated, and I was doing it while I was writing my book. So it's very exciting for me to share some of these findings with you. And what you may not know is that of the 3 great manuscript collections that came about in the late 18th century, 2 of those collections were made by Frenchmen, not by British colonial people. Even though we mostly remember the English patrons, and we call it company art, but actually it began with the French. So I'm going to take you through a little bit of a journey into the collections of these French people. So what were the French doing here, and how important was their role in India? I think is something that we all tend to forget. And I have used these main moments of French interaction in India, which began at the beginning of the 18th century, which time France was by far the stronger player. England was a small country on an island far away with very few resources, very few people, a small army, whereas France was part of continental Europe with a huge standing army, huge resources, all the resources of Europe to tap into. And they were in a far better position. But as the century went on and Britain and France were engaged in truly gargantuan battles across the globe for global dominance, by the mid-18th century, especially during what is known as the 7 Years' War, that was a turning point. Until then, the French in India, especially in the Carnatic, under Dupleix, under Lally, under the Debussy, were all conducting very successful operations. But because of the end of the 7 Years' War, a peace was made, and the British forces, the British colonial forces, took advantage of that peace to throw the French out of all their factories that they had established. And this was the time, in the mid-18th century, when all of these men, these adventurers, these soldiers, these freebooters, were looking for employment in Indian courts because they no longer had faith in their own French government to really carry on this project of colonialism and expansion in India. So this is when our story begins, when these men start looking for the other courts that they may join. And one of the most important ones at this time, we have forgotten a lot about the Subah of Awadh, but it was created by Akbar. It was already an important place in the 16th century, and then it lost some of its importance until in the 18th century we see the arrival of these governors from Persia. So these Persian origin Nawabs set up as governors in the Subah of Awadh and become increasingly more powerful, more prosperous. They turn around the fortunes of Awadh, and by the mid-18th century, when we have the third Nawab, Shuja-ud-Dawla, whom you can see in this painting by Tilly Kettle on the right, he becomes, he makes the Nawabship of Awadh, if you like, a hereditary position, whereas early on the Mughal emperor would tell you who would be the next governor and he would then transfer you to another posting. Now, because of the loss of power at the center, these powerful Nawabs in Hyderabad, in Mysore, in Murshidabad, in Rajasthan, and some of the Rajput kingdoms, they refuse to be transferred, and they stay and they build their Subahs as very, very powerful and prosperous entities. And really the base of what the two Frenchmen are going to do is because of the effort of this man, Shuja-ud-Dawla, especially on the right. You can see that he was a very dynamic, charismatic man, a very brave soldier, a leader of men. He was able to draw people to his cause who were very loyal to him, and he had enormous energy, which once after he was defeated at the Battle of Buxar, we won't go into that today, but then he comes back to Faizabad, which was his capital at that time, and he really expends his energy and his money into developing a really vibrant capital, drawing all the resources of the Mughal Empire. So he starts attracting painters, writers, scribes, poets, dancers, and they all come because he has the money to patronize them. He also has the imagination and the taste and the aesthetics because he knows it's part of being a powerful nobleman at this time. And so he sets up these really, really vibrant, cultural patronage which is extremely vibrant at this time. And the painting on the left is his son Asaf-ud-Dawla, who also continues with this tradition and attracts. They are very keen to attract foreign adventurers and soldiers and experts because they have realized the power of the British, and they have realized that they can use the French in some way, perhaps to stand up to the British. So the first person that we are concerned with today, out of the two huge collections that were created at this time, is a man called Jean-Baptiste Gentil. Now, Jean-Baptiste Gentil came to India in 1751. He spent 26 years in India. The first years he spent in the Carnatic fighting with Dupleix, and then again, like I told you, at the end of the 7 Years' War, he found himself without a job with the French, so he goes and eventually is employed by Shuja-ud-Dawla, where he spends 12 years with the Nawab, very loyal to the Nawab. But this man is an agent of the French King Louis XVI. He is very clear about what his role is. He is an ambassador of Louis XVI to the court of Nawab Shuja-ud-Dawla, and he is going to try as far as possible to gather information that can help the French in helping the Nawab resist the British. So I will read you a section that he has written in his introduction to his manuscript. So he creates this enormous manuscript which will be eventually 183 entire muraccas and some 2,000 miniature paintings which when he goes back to France in 1777, he goes and deposits it at the court of Louis XVI, and today a lot of those documents are at the Royal Library in Paris. So I wanted you to have a sort of idea of what his intention was in his letter. So he addresses the King Louis XVI and he says, this is a rough translation: "My zeal for the glory of my nation motivated me during my years in India to collect everything I could that could inform us about this immense country. The geography and the atlases that I have the honor to present to your majesty are the result of the work of several historians, especially Abu al-Fazl, who has always been regarded as the wisest, ablest minister of this empire. I waited to present these works to you till you had defeated those enemies who had been jealous of our commercial success in India. Now that your glorious reign has increased the fame of France around the world, we can use these manuscripts to extend the commerce of France. My 12 years with the Wazir Shuja-ud-Dawla have enabled me to provide the most exact information on the state of the country. You will be able to gauge how much information your minister may get from these documents to increase the commerce of France, build many factories, especially in the province of Thatta where the French cloth could be sold, and thereby could reduce our need to send gold and silver to India." So he is very clearly saying here that he is using an indigenous source, Abu al-Fazl's writing, which he was in touch with, he was very familiar with, and he says that we can use this information that I am gathering. I have gathered a lot of in-depth information firsthand about the country, and we can use it to help Shuja-ud-Dawla stand up to the British and to increase our own commerce here in India. And one way in which he was able to sort of settle, because he spent 12 years in Faizabad, living this sort of dual life as a Awadhi nobleman and a French soldier and officer, because Shuja-ud-Dawla had him get married to an elite Indo-Portuguese woman called Therese Velo. Now the Nawab Shuja-ud-Dawla had thought this would be a good way to get him to stay in India, to build roots in India. And because this woman, Therese Velo, was from an old Indo-Portuguese family which had connections to the Mughal court, they had to escape from the Mughal court in 1760s during the attacks of Ahmad Shah Abdali, and they came, a lot of their family, the men were massacred, but some of the women survived and they came to the court of Shuja-ud-Dawla, and Shuja-ud-Dawla had Jean-Baptiste Gentil marry this woman. And so this gave Jean-Baptiste Gentil a sort of inroad into Mughal culture through his wife, an understanding of what it was to be a Mughal nobleman, an understanding of the manuscript, of the etiquette, of the way to conduct himself. Now, the first of the many manuscripts that he had, but one of the really important ones, is what is called as the V&A album. It is perhaps the best example of Gentil's albums inspired by the Anne Yagdari. He has commissioned this in 1774, and there are some 58 folios which describe different aspects of the Mughal Empire, from courtly ceremonies to imperial regalia, things like the banners that the Mughals used, their soldiers, the different members of the household, what their function was. He goes in great detail to show all of this, and of course he doesn't miss adding on how important his own role was within not only the Mughal court but in Shuja-ud-Dawla's court. So here we have a very interesting image which details the moment when Shah Alam II, the emperor at this time, who had actually exiled himself from Delhi, after all the fracas of his father being murdered, he had come away, and after the battle of Buxar had been lost, he was actually at Allahabad under the so-called care of the British. And he was very desperate at this time, Shah Alam was, to find resources, to find backing to get back to Delhi. This was really something that drove him, and apart from the French, apart from Gentil, there are very little records that tell us what Shah Alam was up to in these years. I'm sure you will agree that the idea we have of Shah Alam, through British sources mainly, is the man who was defeated. The man who was defeated at Buxar, who had the bad idea to give over the Diwani of Bengal to the British, who seeded the ruin of the British Empire, who had the ill fortune to be blinded in the 1780s by somebody who had been his protege. So all in all, we see him as an enfeebled man, an emasculated man. But if we look at the French records, we see something very different. We see, of course, a much younger man. He wasn't old from the time he was born. We see a man who is vigorous, who is using his imagination, his few resources to try and do something to change his situation, to get back to Delhi, to try and get back some of the power and the resources that he has lost. And in this painting, we actually have a depiction of the important occasion in which Shah Alam came to Faizabad to ask of Shuja-ud-Daulah help and money to get back to Delhi. And we see this painting, for those of you who are used to Indian miniatures, you will see that it is done in a very plain style. There isn't the usual background of many people and animals and vegetation that we are used to seeing in Mughal miniatures. It is instead a much more scientific depiction of the events, which is reinforced by the fact that every little image there has a little note, has a little number, and in a corresponding page, Jean-Baptiste Gentil has written the names of the people, he has written what is happening. So he says this is Shah Alam who has come to the Anguri Bagh and he is passing my house. And in fact, those two pillars that you see next to under Shah Alam are listed as being the gateway to Gentil's own house. So we can see from these pillars that he had a large and important property in Faizabad in a central location. We have not been able to locate it anymore. But in this image, we can see that this is an important moment when Shah Alam stops in front of his house and asks Shuja-ud-Daulah to call Jean-Baptiste Gentil because he has heard of this Frenchman who has been helping Gentil militarily. He has been helping him, improve his ammunition, his factories, train his army. So Shah Alam knows there's an important Frenchman here. And in the following folio, you can see in the detail that this very important moment for Jean-Baptiste Gentil, you can see that he is actually rushing up to the emperor in his red jacket of a French soldier and French officer, and he's putting up his hand to touch the Mughal emperor. And this is clearly a moment of immense importance in Jean-Baptiste's life, and he intends, as he does, to send all of these documents back to France, back to the king, back to a very elite audience who will appreciate through these drawings his own role in the events that are shaping northern India at this time. In this picture, again from the V&A album, I wanted to show you how many images Jean-Baptiste Gentil also patronizes concerning Shuja-ud-Daulah himself. He is a very loyal servant of Shuja-ud-Daulah. He has a lot of admiration for him. He writes in his record that he was a very brave man, that he used all his energies very fruitfully, and he would spend his time hunting and shooting. And there are many, many accounts of how powerful and brave Shuja-ud-Daulah is. Apparently he can kill a buffalo with one stroke of his sword, and he can swim across the river even in spate in the monsoon. And in these two images, which were taken from two completely different manuscripts, Jean-Baptiste Gentil has actually shown the same thing happening. So in the top left, it is an image showing Jean-Baptiste Gentil amongst English company men who have come to visit Shuja-ud-Daulah, and Shuja-ud-Daulah is using a musket to shoot at a matka which is bobbing in the Ghagra river nearby. So thereby showing what a great shot he is and how well he is able to shoot. The other image I have blown up from a much larger section which showed the physical exploits of Shuja-ud-Daulah, and I was interested to see that in the lower right he is showing the same moment. If you can see, it is the same building, sort of pleasure pavilion or a baratri. Shuja-ud-Daulah is standing on it and he is shooting with a musket at the river. So I wonder whether here Gentil is not also making a point about his own involvement in providing high-grade muskets and ammunition and guns to Shuja-ud-Daulah, because it is said that at this point the sort of ammunitions that are produced for Shuja-ud-Daulah are as good, if not better, than what is being produced in France. So this may be a subtle way, a subtle flex for Shuja-ud-Daulah, who's telling us, look how well he can shoot, perhaps because he has a really good gun. This again is a very interesting folio from the same V&A album, which is telling us about a ritual which is happening around the wedding of Asaf-ud-Daula. Now, Asaf-ud-Daula gets married in the 1770s, and clearly Jean-Baptiste Gentil is part of the guest. He has attended these marriage ceremonies, and he tells us about something that we don't hear about a lot. It is a ceremony called the Savani that happens in the first monsoon season following the wedding, in which the mother-in-law, i.e. Bahu Begum, in this case, holds a ceremony for her daughter-in-law in which many gifts are brought, but most importantly, a jhula is brought by the mother-in-law, is gifted to her daughter-in-law. It is set up in the pleasure garden, and it is a ritual that is clearly very important because Gentil has depicted it in this very detailed style. And if you will notice the sort of serpentine used to show people marching, it is quite a new thing. So you have the people who are closest to us are larger, and as the serpentine movement goes towards the distance, they are smaller. Thereby, on a flat surface, you are getting this image and this sensation of people going into the distance. This is something that I have found in several of his folios. Again and again, he is bringing this technique, I feel, in a very effective manner to show on a plain, two-dimensional space this huge cortege moving through the city of Faizabad, coming to the palace perhaps of Bahu Begum, which is divided. You have the Zenana side on the right, divided by a tenting sort of wall, and on the left, of course, you have the huge entourage. And in his the writing which accompanies it, he tells us in French that only Shuja-ud-Daula and Asaf-ud-Daula can cross that tented section. All the other men have to wait outside, and they are entertained by groups of Nautch women. So these wonderful details come out, which an Indian author, an Indian painter may not have thought was important enough to actually put down. Also, little details, like he has written that the Nawab's own pennant is pure white with red dots on it. Now, I had not come across this particular detail anywhere else in my reading. So these little things which are important to, say, a foreign observer are very useful to come across in these documents. Here in this folio, you can once again see the sort of importance that Gentil is giving to the emperor's presence. In 1772, finally, after 12 years in exile in Allahabad, Shah Alam returns to Delhi with the help of Marathas. And Jean-Baptiste Gentil writes of this moment as the accession of Shah Alam to the throne, the proper accession 12 years after he actually came to the throne. Now he is back in this important place, the Dar al-Khilafat, which is the seat of Mughal power, and I believe Gentil is the only person to talk in detail about this important moment and to show a sort of pictorial representation of what that looked like, with Shah Alam in the center with his parasol above him, all his liege men to either side of him, with women doing a notch in front of him. At the bottom, there is a number of ceremonies that are taking place, including the Tuledan around his accession, but also a ceremony that I have never come across in any other writing. It is one in which he describes, and you can see it in the lower left center, where actually Shah Alam is sitting on like a takht, and he is surrounded by some noblemen. And what happens is that, according to Jean-Baptiste Gentil, is that Shah Alam writes out a few lines from the Quran, puts it in a bowl of water, sips a bit of water from that bowl, puts a lot of rings inside that bowl, and then distributes that ring to all the noblemen who are standing there. And I don't know, Rana, if you have come across this. I asked William also, and he's also never come across this ritual. It is obviously something that did happen. He didn't invent it, but it is very little known, and it deserves further study, and further investigation about what it might have meant. This image has not been signed, so we don't know if it was indeed Gentil, but it will look, I think you will agree, very similar to the serpentine motion I have been showing you. It is again a very important moment that we have been talking about, which is Shah Alam's actual return to Shah Jahanabad. So we see the cortege with the imperial elephant, with Shah Alam, with the ladies of the Zenana in their closed palanquins and accompanied by soldiers, and they are making their way into the distance, and into the distance is Shah Jahanabad. If you look at it closely, scholars have said that this is actually very clearly Shah Jahanabad. So this is a very important moment, the return of Shah Alam, which we don't often hear about, and certainly not pictorially represented in this manner. The other really important document that he created at this time, in fact he creates it before the earlier so-called Vianney album, is what is known as the Gentil Atlas. Now, up till this time we did not really have maps of India per se in this manner, and Jean-Baptiste Gentil is actually the first to come up with who starts to visualize the topographical information about the country using local information, because he tells us that he uses Abu al-Fazl's Ain al-Akbari. You know that Abu al-Fazl had already talked about the subas and he had described them. So Gentil uses that document. He uses European techniques of cartography, so he adds that also into this document, and he uses his own personal experience of what it is like to live in these places, to have traveled in these places. So there are many additional place names, river names, forests, land masses that he describes. This one is the Suba of Aurangabad, and what is interesting about the atlas, which is about 42 folios, is that he has on the edges like a vignette telling us something about the cultural history of that Suba, the mythology, the rites and rituals. So he is encouraging us to look at this pictorial representation in addition to the cartography of the Subas. And in the one of Aurangabad, it's extremely interesting to see in the top that he has described and drawn the Ellora caves. Now, according to the Indologist Anquetil Duperron, who comes to India at this time and visits the Ellora caves, and who has a very poor idea of the Frenchmen in India, and he says they are all, a bunch of uneducated people who cannot appreciate the beauties of the country. Only Gentil, according to him, has understood the significance of the Ellora caves, and we in fact can corroborate that with this information from the Aurangabad page. Another interesting Suba is the one of Ajmer. It's a very important Suba clearly because there is the Ajmer Dargah, which is very important to the Mughals, and again we see an important ritual taking place in the topmost section as part of the vignettes happening in the Suba of Ajmer, which is that Shah Alam is visiting the Pirzada at Ajmer Dargah, and Jean-Baptiste Gentil writes and says, when Shah Alam goes and visits the Pirzada, then the bow which is kept there becomes taut with the arrow on its own. Now again, I have not come across, I think I discussed this with you also, Rana, I don't think you have also come across this. So again, a very important and interesting phenomenon that is happening around Shah Alam, and he doesn't just mention it here, it is corroborated by a second document in which he talks about this, that to show that this is actually sign that the Mughal emperor is the legitimate sovereign of Hindustan, the legitimate ruler, Mughal ruler who should be in Delhi, because this bow and arrow, which has special significance lying in the Dargah of Ajmer Sharif, becomes taut, and the bow becomes taut of its own. So this is a very, very interesting little vignette here as well. The last document that I want to talk to you about is this extremely important one, and it might be of interest to you to know that until this time, this very particular time, the 1770s, actually we don't have pictorial representations only of buildings in India. Now, it may seem counterintuitive, but if you think of Mughal paintings, there will be buildings in the background. We do have, especially in Rajasthani Rajput paintings, they often have a fort in the background, but it's very much part of the action of what is happening. So you will have an army marching towards the fort, or you will have some action. You will have, a beautiful woman, in the middle of a baradri, or some nautch taking place, dancing happening, and in the background is a building which may or not be exactly like the building is meant to be. But here you have this collection of 25 folios. Now they are very, very large. They were large scrolls, about 1 to 2 meters long, and they were actually kept as scrolls, and when they were shown to the king, I suppose first, they were unscrolled, unfolded and showed, in this manner across. And the painters made it by taking bits of handmade graph paper. You can see in some of the, I think the lower right one, you can actually see the squares of the graph paper. Now this is a very new innovation taking place in art in India at this time. They are using handmade graph paper and they make little sections of this painting and then they paste it onto this large scroll to make this extraordinary diagram almost of these important Mughal and Faizabadi and Lucknowi buildings. Of course, it's interesting that he chooses a lot of Mughal architecture. He chooses the Taj Mahal. He has, of course, the fort in Red Fort. He has Shuja-ud-Daula's palace, a number of other palaces, also the gate at Tripolia in Delhi and in Faizabad. And what he does also, sorry, I'm coming to the thing, yeah. What he does also is that he participates in the making of these diagrams. Chanchal Dadlani has talked a lot about this. He uses French cartographical traditions, visual traditions, and he encourages his local Indian painters to absorb some of those traditions, but then create something that is entirely new. The monuments of Shah Jahan are emphasized, and you can see that there is sort of a standardized vocabulary around these images. You can easily say that this is coming from the same album because they have a similarity, a similar visual sort of elegance to them that you can see taken from one to the other. Here we have the Palace of Nizam-ul-Mulk at the top, and you can see that at least in this painting, it is as though the Indian painter has not been able to resist his urge, and he has painted those clouds and the sky in a more typically Indian miniature way, whereas all the others are very plain white background. I don't know what his patron had to say about this. But extremely interesting and interesting to know that these were the very first images of Indian buildings made in India. So ultimately he would use this collection again to position himself back in France as the authority on Indian history and culture. Now we come to a very different sort of creature, very different man. I'll just skip through this because we don't have a great deal of time. This is a folio from a different collection of his on on Hindu gods and goddesses. And what I found interesting that is while the gods and goddesses are drawn in this slightly fanciful manner, the plants are drawn almost in a botanical, scientific manner, and all the plants and trees which had a value, a commercial value, are drawn very clearly in this folio. He also had a lot of Sanskrit manuscripts and Persian manuscripts. But now we come to the second gentleman that I wanted to talk about, who is Antoine Paulier, a very different sort of man to Jean-Baptiste Gentil, who was this sort of sober, sincere, slightly dull man, if I may say so. It's not me, but it is his own sponsor, the governor of Chandanagar, who was introducing him when he was going back to France, and he told that person, don't be underwhelmed by this man, by his sincerity and his very dull persona. He's actually a very good man. So here in Antoine Paulier, we have a very different sort of man. We have a very swaggering, charismatic sort of man, and Maya Jasanoff, the scholar, has talked about him as being a chameleon and a shapeshifter. And he really was someone like this. He was someone who had a life, as we can see on the right, as an Awadhi nobleman. So he had the garbs, he wore the costume, he wore the clothes, he enjoyed Nach, he himself was very knowledgeable about music and dance, but he was also an officer in the British East India Company. So he very clearly, even though he came from a French family, he was actually from a Protestant French family that was in Switzerland. So he aligned himself very quickly, being a Protestant, with the British cause. And he stayed with them for a while till he found he was not being promoted any further. And he asked Warren Hastings to be sent to the court of Nawab Shuja-ud-Daula as an engineer and an architect, which is where he ended up and spent a lot of his career, and where he brought together this really extraordinary collection of manuscripts. it is thanks to my friend Pramod Kumar, the art historian and curator, who first told me that I must track down these manuscripts wherever they are. He said, you must do whatever you can to see these manuscripts. They have not been seen in India. They had not been digitized when I started my work in 2020. There are very few accounts of it. Please try and see if you can see them. And I started harassing because I knew where they were kept. The curator, Frederica Weiss, of the Islamic Museum in Berlin, and I think she was so fed up by my constant harassment that she invited me in 2021 to the very first symposium on Antoine Polier paintings, where scholars from across the world were invited for these 3 days and gave extraordinary insights into the sort of collection that we have in the Islamic Museum in Berlin. And here we have me, the interloper, who's getting all this information for free as it was, and able to share some of this with you. Since then, a lot of work has been done. All these albums have been digitized, so I encourage you, whoever has an interest, because Frederica Weiss has made a lot of effort to democratize this information, to put it out there on the website, to have all these essays also available. So please do, if you're interested, access them. So look, I wanted to show you how very different these manuscripts were from what we were talking earlier. And Frederica Weiss herself says that the majority of his paintings were made between 1773 and 1785. And she says they are astonishingly close imitations of traditional Mughal murakas, because they have this, so the first page has this traditional shams, this sunburst medallion, beautifully decorated with gold work with the name of the patron in the middle, followed by alternating calligraphy and paintings, calligraphies and paintings, just as you would have found in a traditional Mughal muraka, which you don't find in many other so-called company-sponsored work. And the other notable thing to see in these paintings is that the margins are very beautifully illuminated. So he had an amazing atelier of painters. He borrowed some of them from Jean-Baptiste Gentil, but then he created his own. He used somebody called Meher Chand, who is now considered the greatest artist of the late 18th century. And look at these, the borders, how they have these typical double narrow border in dark blue, and in the middle you have this beautiful illustration, floral illustration. So this is very typical of all of Polier's murakas, 12 of which at least exist as is in Berlin. And you will be familiar with the fact that many albums at this time were scattered, they were broken apart, they were sold folio by folio, so that today it is very difficult to put together these murakas and albums, and thereby very difficult to understand and gauge what the intention of the patron was, what they are trying to tell us about the state of the country. But these albums are in their entirety as is. This painting also shows us a series of paintings he also commissioned on buildings in Delhi and some in Lucknow, but I think mostly in Delhi. So he was the second of the French painters to do this. And here you see he uses a very typical manner of encouraging his painters to paint from this bird's eye perspective. So we have this elevated view into the buildings, far into the distance, in an absolutely perfect perspective. So if you look at all the straight lines that are going from the side of the this royal encampment, the tents, they are all leading to one invisible point at the end perfectly. Whereas I'm sure many of you are familiar with the way in which Indian artists were doing it, was to have lots of different points of views within the same painting, because their motivation was different. They were not interested in painting a real scene. They wanted to show what that building suggested, what they stood for, the use of those buildings. So, but Polier makes sure that his artists paint this painting in this perspective, using this bird's eye elevated perspective, which gives us almost a sense of having an intimate view into what is happening, because like in this painting of the Red Fort, we can actually see into the emperor's harem, we can see into the main buildings of the emperor, which obviously Polier was not being able to do. So at the same time, we get a feeling that is both intimate but voyeuristic, because we are having a look at something we are not meant to be looking at, and which is patently untrue, because Polier was not being invited into these closed spaces. But yet he uses this technique, which does sort of suggest that we are sort of being made participants in what is happening inside these buildings. a beautiful image of the Taj just for Rana here, who has curated this beautiful exhibition at the Taj Mahal. And you can see again, note how beautifully the reflection of the Taj Mahal is depicted, in the river. Note also how in this painting the two structures on either side, the mosque and the mihrab khana, are actually tilted to the side. They are not in perfect perspective, so that we can have a slight peep again into what is happening into either building, as well as what is happening in the main mausoleum of the Taj. So really, one of the first depictions of the Taj Mahal was a Frenchman. We'll say that here and be done with it. Another painting using the same technique. Again, we are getting an intimate view of this nobleman, who it is believed may be Jawan Bakht, Shehzada Jawan Bakht, the Mughal prince who came away from Delhi looking for support for his father and landed up in Lucknow in 1784. So this is possibly him enjoying a quiet moment in his zenana. So clearly, again, Polier would not have been privy to this scene, but because he is having it painted in the same manner, we feel like we are, sharing an intimate moment with the prince. And this lovely meandering river in the background disappearing into the horizon. Okay, I just wanted to show you. Whoops, what have I closed out? Yeah, here we are. We'll get there. Almost. It doesn't want to show. Yeah, I just wanted to show you how glorious the border images truly are in all of Polier's albums. I just chose these completely at random. I didn't choose the best ones, but just look at the marginal images, how absolutely beautiful they are. And he had a full-on Mughal style atelier, not just with painters, but with calligraphers, with bookbinders, with illuminators, with all these craftspeople who he was able to attract from Mughal Delhi. And then he used his own, he had a very strong aesthetic sense. We know from his letters, which are Persian letters, which were translated, that he gave very strict directives to his painters and to his illuminators, to his margin makers, and he said, I want it in this color, I want this combination, don't go overboard with the colors. He gave very strict instructions, so we see his own personal taste in these murakas. Just an image to show you where one of the inspirations for some of these paintings, especially of Hindu gods and goddesses, may have been. So you have in the middle an engraving by Bernard Picard. So Bernard Picard was a Frenchman of the early 18th century who never set foot in India, but he made all these very elaborate drawings and engravings of the Hindu gods and goddesses. And one of the very popular ones was Dashavatar, and here you can see the Varaha avatar in the middle. And on the right is Jean-Baptiste Gentil's an image from his folio. You can see how similar it is to Bernard's Picard's engraving, and on the left you can see Polier's image. So you can see how these murakkas and how these paintings are actually talking to each other. They're not happening in isolation. They're talking to the Mughal center, they're talking to Delhi artists. The Delhi artists are traveling, they're traveling with their skills. They are then seeing a different world in Faizabad, in Lucknow. They are interacting with a changing world, a changing cultural background, and they're producing new things. This is also from a Picard engraving, and I think it's interesting to see how similar it is to the sort of serpentine images I was talking about. And this last series of images, just to show you how these two men actually influenced the way in which painters would paint Shuja-ud-Daulah himself. So before the arrival of a certain painter called Tilly Kettle, who was an English painter in oils, Shuja-ud-Daulah and other noblemen like him would be painted in this manner by classic Mughal artists, where you can hardly distinguish Shuja-ud-Daulah from the other noblemen, except for the fact that he's wearing a band, a sort of brocaded band around his turban, and very few objects around him, high value objects that are placed to show that he is somebody elite, but you can't really make out from facial features or anything who he is. Things changed completely when Tilly Kettle arrived, and he painted images like the one on the left here. This is an oil painting of Shuja-ud-Daulah, and you can see how very different this is in the psychology of the painting, in the visual artistry of it, how it is willing to show Shuja-ud-Daulah as he is, as a real human, instead of this idealized person. And this really influenced local Indian artists, because Polier and Gentil both encouraged their artists to look at these paintings. And these artists, remember, would not perhaps have been given the chance by Shuja-ud-Daulah to pose for him. They would not have had access to a leader like Shuja-ud-Daulah. But by looking at Tilly Kettle's paintings, they get a chance to study the physiognomy of Shuja-ud-Daulah, and on the right, they interpreted the Shuja-ud-Daulah in a completely new way, which almost becomes a template from now on about how Shuja-ud-Daulah would be painted. On the left, you see a copy of the sort of oval paintings which become very popular around this time, medallions type oil painting that are made. Here the Indian artist has copied that. He has painted Shuja-ud-Daulah, with his high cheekbones and marvelous mustaches. He's also put in the swirling cloud behind, almost like an oil painting. And on the right, a very famous painting, which is Shuja-ud-Daulah and Asaf-ud-Daulah with 9 other sons, after an oil painting by Tilly Kettle, made by Meher Chand, who has now been acknowledged as this great painter. And I will leave you with this last painting, which has recently gone on auction at Christie's for a mere £2.5 million. This was painted by Meher Chand under the patronage of Antoine Pouillet, which is quite extraordinary. We see Antoine Pouillet himself painted here. So Antoine Pouillet, we can see him in this liminal stage between Mughal nobleman and French officer, because despite the fact that he is wearing this long jama and he has a turban and he's watching a dance performance, he has still kept his socks. He has kept this metaphorical distance between himself and the Indian soil. And Malini Roy, who was lucky enough to see this painting before it went to auctions, she saw it in live, if you like. She noticed that at the back of his head, he actually has tied back his hair with a black ribbon, like a French nobleman. So he's kind of hedging his bets. He is also Awadhi nobleman, but if you look closely, he's still also a French officer. So I will leave you at that. If anyone has a few £1 million spare, they can still buy up some of these paintings.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, ma'am, for your kind words and detailed lecture. And here there is a poetry in Persian that suits here. आगाज़ सुखन इन बुद जिन मस्ती ओ हैरानी, आगाज़ सुखन इन बुद जिन मस्ती ओ हैरानी, पायान सुखन बिश्नाओ वक्त अस्ति बाज़ाई. This was the beginning of the talk lecture. Now it's time is the comment, not the translation. I'm giving you the thing what is going on. That interesting talk lecture is gone, and now it's time to comment. So now I would like to call Professor Farhat Hassan, our chair of the evening, to share his comment and reflection on the lecture.
Well, thank you, Ira, for this very fascinating presentation. And I learned a lot from your lecture today. You see, I think there are 3 important issues that come out of your presentation. One is that most historical narratives on the 18th century and the Awadh Empire focus on Persian and English sources. And this does create a very lopsided understanding of the historical developments taking place in that period. So that the recovery of French source material and the use and application of that archive does serve as a corrective to the historical distortion that we find in English sources as also in Persian sources. So I think that's very commendable. Secondly, I also found it very interesting that the French had an interest in exploring the inner life, the cultural resources of India, as also an engagement with domesticity and the harem when they look at the political culture of the period. And I thought this was very interesting because this was an important site about which we know absolutely nothing. And because of that, we have very distorted understanding of domestic spaces in the 18th and the 19th century India. I thought that the French evidence that you brought to light brought harem in conversation with the imperial court, and instead of looking or locating harem as a site of pleasure, excess, all sorts of degeneration, we get a new understanding of the harem as engaged in a constructive conversation with issues of imperial sovereignty. So I thought these are really important takeaways from your lecture. There were a few confusions though. One is that I'm very suspicious when I read any source as an empirical text as providing the truth of the period. We now know that Mughal texts represent the imperial point of view. The English texts are motivated by the need to establish colonial domination. Now these two perspectives are certainly absent in French source material, but they're still not innocent texts. They still have to be contextualized, they still have to be problematized, and we need to find the political context that informs these discourses. So I thought it would be interesting. I thought maybe this is the continuous confrontation with the English that informs the narratives that you find in the French sources. I was also very intrigued by the fact, and I think this was missing because Seema Alvi and Muzaffar Alam have translated the Persian letters of Polier. So I thought it was very important that these French writers were writing in Persian, and in Iran Culture House is something that needs to be emphasized, and we need to see as to what kind of an intervention were these French writers making in the shaping of the Persianate culture, and not only were they writing letters, they were also composing poetry, and this is a long trend that you notice from the 18th down to the 19th century. In 19th century in Aligarh, you have this person called Shore, John Shore. Rahat Abrad is a book on him, who was there at the revolt of 1857. So he provides a French narrative on the revolt of 1857. But the more important thing is that you also have his Diwan in Persian. So I was also wondering if this is an important aspect that needs to be explored as to the kind of contribution that the foreign, don't call them foreign, that the Persian scholars and administrators were making to the shaping of the Persianate culture in 18th and 19th century India. Thank you very much. Yeah.
Thank you so much, sir. Now الان من از دکتر فروالدین فریدعصر تقاضا میکنم که اونا درباره این مصاحبه یا هر چیزی که در دل دارن، حرف دارن، اون را بگوین اینجا. خواهش میکنم از شما.
پروفسور چندرشکر، دکتر ایرا مخاتی، پروفسور فرحت حسن، پروفسور فاطمه بلقیس حسینی، دکتر قهرمان سلیمانی، and my good friend آقای صدام حسین, respected guests, ladies and gentlemen, good evening و السلام علیکم. من بلندگوی شما میکروفون داری که یک کار ترجمه‌ای هم بکنید دیگه. خیلی متشکرم از سخنرانی علمی و هنری خانم مخاتی. برای من خیلی جذاب بود.
बहुत बहुत शुक्रिया मैडम मुखोती जी, बहुत ही इंटरेस्टिंग था और मेरे लिए बहुत ही दिलचस्प था आपका ये प्रेजेंटेशन आज का.
من خواهش میکنم که نسخه ای از مقالهشون رو و متن سخنرانیشون رو در اختیار من بگذارم.
मेरी ख्वाहिश होगी कि आप इसका अगर प्रिंटेड फॉर्म में आप हमें दे सकें, प्रोवाइड कर सकें, तो हम इसे ज़रूर रखना चाहेंगे. आपने प्रदर्शन दी है.
برای ما در واقع بررسی شیوه های حکمرانی و کسب اطلاعات بیشتر درباره حکومت نواب اود بسیار واجد اهمیت هست از چند بود. یک بودش این است که خب شما میدونید نواب عوض در واقع خاندان ایرانی بودند، اینها از نیشابور آمده بودند و در اینجا برای مدتی حکومت کردند و به نوعی حاملان فرهنگ ایران در هند بودند. بخشی از فرهنگ هند در ایران توسط خاندان عوض منتقل شده. این یک نکته از اهمیت.
मेरे लिए ये इसलिए भी इंटरेस्टिंग है कि मैं ये समझना चाहता हूँ कि इंडिया में जो नवाबीन अवध का जो काइंड ऑफ गवर्नेंस था उसको मैं बेटर तरीके से समझना चाहता हूँ, इसलिए भी कि अवध जो थे वो बेसिकली नेशापुर से थे, दे वर फ्रॉम ईरान। सो इसलिए उन्हें एक तरीके से इंडिया में ईरानियन कल्चर का एम्बेसडर कहा जाए, या वो लोग कि जो वहाँ से उन तमाम चीज़ों को लेकर के यहाँ आए और उसके बाद किस तरह से इंडिया के साथ एसिमिलेट हुए और किस तरीके से यहाँ पे उन्होंने वो अपना डायनेस्टी का सिलसिला जारी रखा, उसको मैं प्रॉपर वे में और समझना चाहता हूँ.
یک نکته هم که جناب پروفسور فرحت حسن هم فرمودند و در این سخنرانی ویژه بود، توجه در واقع به مطالعات و اون آثار فرانسوی هاست درباره نواب عوض. خب اینجا در کتابخانه میکروفیلم نور نسخه های فارسی و انگلیسی وجود داره درباره نواب عوض. این که توجه شد به بخش در واقع مطالعات فرانسوی خب خیلی از این جهت هم برای ما نو بود و جذاب بود.
और जो प्रोफेसर हसन साहब ने जो पॉइंट्स रेज किए मेरे लिए बहुत ही इंटरेस्टिंग बात थी, और मुझे भी अच्छा लगा कि नवाबीन अवध के ऊपर इस एंगल से हमने इसको देखा और इसे बरता। अदरवाइज दो अलग अलग पर्शियन और इंग्लिश के नैरेटिव्स थे जो आमतौर पर एड्रेस किए जाते हैं और एकेडमिक्स में उसको लाया जाता है। बाकी यहाँ ईरान कल्चर हाउस में नूर बैकग्राउंड सेंटर में काफ़ी सारा एविडेंस मैन्युस्क्रिप्ट्स की शक्ल में इसी पर्टिकुलर नवाबीन अवध के बारे में मौजूद है जिसे एक्सेस किया जा सकता है.
خب اما درباره این جلسه تشکر میکنم برای سومین سالی که در واقع دارم تجربه میکنم و درک میکنم برگزاری مراسم یادبود پروفسور عابدی رو. باید تشکر بکنیم از برگزار کنندگان این جلسه، به طور خاص از خانم پروفسور فاطمه بلقیس، به طور خاص از پروفسور چندرشکر و فرزند برومند پروفسور عابدی که این جلسه رو مهتم به برگزار کردنش هستن و بسیار مشعوفم و افتخار میکنم به زیارت این عزیزانی که هر سال به یاد پروفسور عابدی و امسال در 10مین سالگرد یادبود او اینجا گرد آمدن.
मैं बहुत ही शुक्रगुजार हूँ उन तमाम लोगों का जिन्होंने ये एक्सटेंशन लेक्चर यहाँ ऑर्गेनाइज़ किया प्रोफेसर मिशन अवधी साहब की याद में, और ये मेमोरियल लेक्चर जिसका मैं ये तीसरा लगातार साल है कि मैं विटनेस हूँ इसका, मैं यहाँ शरीक हूँ इसमें, और ये 10वां दौर है। तो इसके लिए मैं प्रोफेसर बिल्किस फातिमा हुसैनी साहबा का और प्रोफेसर चंद्रशेखर साहब का और मरहूम प्रोफेसर मिशन अवधी साहब के फैमिली के वो तमाम लोग के जो इस एक्सटेंशन लेक्चर के लिए इतना एहतमाम करते हैं और उसके बाद इसका इंतज़ाम करते हैं, मैं उन तमाम लोगों का शुक्रगुजार हूँ जिन्होंने उस बुज़ुर्ग और उस अजीम इंसान का नाम इस तरह ज़िंदा रखा हुआ है.
خیلی وقت شما رو نمیگیرم، به شما خوش آمد میگم در خانه فرهنگ جمهوری اسلامی ایران. خانه فرهنگ جمهوری اسلامی ایران مثل همه شما ادای احترام میکنه به همه اساتید و خدمتگزاران زبان فارسی و فرهنگ فارسی و فرهنگ در واقع پژوهشگران فرهنگ ایران و هند، و به طور خاص احساس احترام و دین میکنه به تلاش‌ها و مقام علمی جناب استاد پروفسور عابدی.
मैं आप लोगों का बहुत टाइम नहीं लूँगा, मैं ये अर्ज़ कर दूँ कि ये ईरान कल्चर हाउस है और यहाँ पर हर वो इंसान के जो पर्शियन के उस्ताद हैं या थे, या जो भी ऐसे स्कॉलर्स हैं जो इंडो ईरान रिलेशंस के ऊपर रिसर्च वर्क कर रहे हैं, या जो भी इस तरह के एकेडमिक कंट्रीब्यूशंस हैं जिनके भी, उन सब के लिए हमारी तरफ से बहुत ज़्यादा जो है वो उनका एहतराम है, उनका रिस्पेक्ट है, और हमेशा हम इस बात की कोशिश करते हैं कि उनके तई हमारा जो रवैया हो बहुत ज़्यादा रिस्पेक्टफुल हो.
فقط یک بیت شعر از سعدی میخوانم و عرضم رو تمام میکنم درباره مرحوم پروفسور عابدی که سعدی فرمود: سعدیا مرد نکونام نمیرد هرگز، مرده آن است که نامش به نکویی نبرند.
मैं आखिर में सादी शिराजी का एक शेर पढ़ूंगा और शेर को डेडिकेट करूंगा प्रोफेसर मिशन अवधी साहब को, जिस शेर में सादी शिराजी ने कहा है कि सादी कभी भी जो नेक इंसान जिसने नोबेल किस्म की लाइफ गुजारी है वो कभी नहीं मरता है. मरता वो है कि जिसका कोई नाम और उसका कोई इम्पैक्ट ना हो उसको दुनिया से जाने के बाद.
خیلی ممنون دکتر فریدالدین فریدعصر برای این حرفایی که شما گفتین اینجا و این شعر مولوی برای اینجا که ما جمع شدیم. این سخن پایان ندارد بازران، این سخن پایان ندارد بازران، تا نمانیم از قطار کاروان. که this is the sitting, this is the lecture, it's don't have any end. We can continue and continue and continue because it's on the name of Professor Abidi and the history of India, or in Persian or English, so we can continue. But we don't have much time, so now I would like to call Dr. Kahraman Suleimani. Ustad shoma befirmain.
سلام عرض میکنم خدمت همه دوستان عزیز. خیلی خیلی خوش آمدید. من متخصص تاریخ هند نیستم.
आप सभी का बहुत बहुत इस्तकबाल है, बहुत बहुत शुक्रिया. अलबत्ता मैं इंडियन हिस्ट्री का एक्सपर्ट नहीं हूँ.
ولی مقاله‌ای که خانم خوتی دادن از این باب که ذکر دقیق جزئیات بود، نمونه ای از یک تحقیق علمی خیلی خیلی خوب بود که من تو این مدت شنیدم.
जो प्रेजेंटेशन थी डॉक्टर एरा मुखोती जी की, जिसमें जिस तरीके से डिटेल्स थी, वो ये दर्शाता है कि आपने कितनी कोशिशों और कितनी मेहनतों के साथ इसको प्रिपेयर किया था.
چون بعضی دانشجویان جوان هم هستند، به نظرم این میتونه یک سرمشق خوبی برای دانشجویان جوان باشه برای مطالعاتشون.
ये मैंने इसलिए कहा कि यहाँ बहुत सारे यंगस्टर्स हैं, स्कॉलर्स हैं, उनके लिए ये एक बेहतरीन एग्जांपल है कि जब किसी चीज़ को प्रिपेयर करते हैं तो कितनी ज़्यादा बारीकियों का लिहाज रखा जाता है.
اما همونجور که دوست عزیز و با فضیلت هم چندشکر گفتم، ما قبل از اینکه بیام اینجا درباره پروفسور عابدی صحبت می‌کردیم.
मगर जैसा कि प्रोफेसर चंद्रशेखर साहब ने भी कहा, जो कि हमारे अजीज़ दोस्त हैं, उन्होंने फरमाया कि हम यहाँ आने से पहले तक अभी प्रोफेसर मिशन अवधी साहब के बारे में बात कर रहे थे.
شاعر عرب میگه که تلک آثارنا تدل علینا فانظروا بعدنا الی الاثار. فکر میکنم که از استاد عابدی دو اثر باقی مونده. یکی مجموعه دانشجویان، شاگردان، علاقه‌مندانی هستند که بعد از ایشون 10 سال این مجلس رو سر پا داشتن. یکی هم مجموعه نوشته هاشون که مضبوط هست، مشکلی وجود نداره، ولی این روح علمی که در این جلسه هست نشانه این حق شناسی ملت هند نسبت به این فرزند شایسته خودش هست.
प्रोफेसर आबिदी साहब की जो लेगेसी है उसको ऑल टुगेदर दो हिस्सों में उसको तकसीम किया जा सकता है. एक तो जो कुछ उन्होंने लिखा है किताबों की शक्ल में, आर्टिकल्स की शक्ल में, और एक बहुत बड़ी तादाद है ऐसे स्टूडेंट्स की जिसकी उन्होंने तरबियत की, उन्हें पढ़ाया. ये भी ज़ाहिर है कि ये भी उन्हीं की मीरास है और उन्हीं का हिस्सा है कि जो एक अजीम खिदमत के तौर पर हिंदुस्तान में छोड़ के गए. और यहाँ के लोगों को भी सलाम है कि जिन्होंने उनकी कदरदानी की, और आज उनका ये 10वां मेमोरियल लेक्चर है जिसके लिए यहाँ हिंदुस्तान के लोग, असातिज़ा और उनके घर के लोग और सारे ही लोग जो उनसे जुड़े हैं समहाव, वो उनके नाम को ज़िंदा रखे हुए हैं.
فکر میکنم که این سنت بسیار خوب، البته هند همیشه برای ما ایرانی ها الهام بخش بوده، ولی این سنت از اون سنت هایی هست، این اتفاقی که در اینجا افتاده برای ما هم یک درس هست برای اینکه یاد گذشتگان خودمون رو در قالب های علمی بتونیم زنده نگه داریم.
इंडिया हमारे लिए हमेशा जो है वो बहरहाल इंस्पिरेशन का सोर्स रहा है, बट ये एक ट्रेडिशन, बहुत अच्छा ट्रेडिशन है कि आप कोई भी एकेडमिक एक्टिविटी करें और उसको किसी एक अपने बड़े और पुराने नाम को डेडिकेट करें, इस तरह भी उसके नाम को ज़िंदा रखा जा सकता है। ये बहुत अच्छा आइडिया है।
اما یک پیشنهاد کوچیک هم دارم، چون جمعمون تاریخدانان حضور دارند.
मैं एक सजेशन भी है मेरे पास, वो भी इसलिए कि ऐसे बहुत सारे लोग हैं कि जो हिस्ट्री में सरोकार रखते हैं।
بعد از فروپاشی شوروی یونسکو یک اهتمامی به خرج داد و جمعی از تاریخدانان کشورهای حوزه آسیای مرکزی به ایران نشستن یک تاریخ مشترک نوشتند.
सोवियत यूनियन के डाउनफॉल के बाद यूनेस्को ने एक ऐसी कॉन्फ्रेंस की जिसमें तमाम एशिया के और सारी कंट्रीज़ के तमाम हिस्टोरियंस को जमा किया गया और उनसे ये चाहा गया कि एक ऐसी कॉमन हिस्ट्री सब मिल करके लिखें, कंपाइल करें।
این تاریخ به چند زبان البته تا الان منتشر شده، من جمله به زبان فارسی و انگلیسی.
और इसे कई सारी ज़बानों में पब्लिश किया गया है, इंक्लूडिंग पर्शियन लैंग्वेज।
ما در फهم تاریخ عموماً یک جاهایی با هم ممکنه اتفاق نظر نداشته باشیم در تاریخ مشترک.
मे भी हम हिस्ट्री में किसी पर्टिकुलर फेज या किसी टाइम किसी पॉइंट पर आकर के डिफर करें हमारी ओपिनियन एक दूसरे से।
خوشبختانه هم در ایران هم در هند تشکل‌ها و انجمن‌های علمی تاریخ وجود داره.
फॉर्चुनेटली इंडिया और ईरान दोनों ही जगहों पर ऐसी बहुत सारी ऑर्गेनाइजेशंस हैं कि जो हिस्ट्री से रिलेटेड काम करती हैं।
من میخوام پیشنهاد بدم که یک تاریخ مشترک ایران و هند خوب هست در دستور کار این دوستان تاریخدان قرار بگیره.
मेरी ख्वाहिश होगी कि एक ऐसी कॉमन हिस्ट्री लिखना जो है वो तमाम हिस्टोरियंस के प्रोजेक्ट्स में शुमार हो जो इंडिया और ईरान से हैं, और वो ऐसी हिस्ट्री लिखें जिसमें सिर्फ और इंडिया और ईरान की एक कॉमन हिस्ट्री को उसमें डील किया जा सके।
ممکنه زمان ببره نوشتن این تاریخ، ولی در نهایت نتیجه‌ای که حاصل میشه این هست که یک متن مورد توافق تاریخی از نظرگاه عالمان تاریخ برای دو کشور منتشر میشه.
मे भी ये थोड़ा टाइम टेकिंग हो, मगर ये मुझे यकीन है कि लास्ट में जो इसका आउटकम होगा और जो लिखा जाएगा उसमें एक ऐसी कॉमन आई मीन हिस्ट्री का कंटेंट निकल के आएगा जिसमें दोनों ही कंट्रीज़ के लोगों को जिस पे वो राज़ी होंगे उनको लगेगा दीज आर द फैक्ट्स।
این پیشنهاد میتونه در یک سال آینده پخته بشه، پیرامونش بحث بشه. من میتونم عرض کنم که از جانب ایران این آمادگی وجود داره که در این پروژه مشترک شرکت کنند تاریخدان‌های ما.
ये जो सजेशन है, जो मेरा आइडिया है, मैं भी इसको आई मीन प्रॉपर वे में, फॉर्मल वे में इसको शेप लेने में थोड़ा टाइम लगे, साल भर लग जाए खाली इसको एक प्रॉपर एक कॉन्सेप्ट और थीम बनने में। बट उसके बाद जब कभी भी इस पर हम एग्री करके इसको फॉर्मली अनाउंस करके इसको इनिशिएट करेंगे तो इस पर काम कर सकते हैं। मैं ये कह सकता हूँ कि ईरान में इस पॉइंट पर फुल्ली रेडीनेस और तैयारी और आमादगी है। देखना यह है कि हिंदुस्तान की तरफ से इस सिलसिले में क्या रिस्पॉन्स आता है।
به این فکر میکنم که استمرار راهی هست که پروفسور عابدی انتخاب کرده بودن. برای همه شما آرزوی توفیق دارم.
ये भी मैं अर्ज़ कर दूं कि ये वो रास्ता है कि जो उस रास्ते को कंटिन्यू करता है जिसे प्रोफेसर मिस्टर आबदी साहब ने शुरू किया था।
Highly mamnoon, Ustad. Thank you so much. Now it's time to give the token of love from the society to the Miss Ira Mukhoti. I request Dr. Kahraman Suleimani, please present a token of love to Miss Ira.
I'm coming in the way, I guess. Yeah, well, how do we take it?
Now to Professor Farhat Hussain, it will give the token of love from Professor Chandrasekhar. Please. So now I request Professor Chandrasekhar to give the Dr. Faruddin Faridas token of love. And now to Dr. Kahraman Suleimani.
distinguished dignitaries on the dais and the august audience. As announced, I'm reciting a mystical ghazal as a tribute to my revered teacher and subsequently my colleague, Professor Amir Hassan Abidi. He liked my ghazal singing very much. He used to say, Shamim, kya ghazal gaati ho? Just very legit. Sagi beshu do rangiye ummeed bhi mura. Sagi beshu do rangiye ummeed bhi mura. Benuma bema haqiqate range qadeem ra. Benuma bema haqiqate range qadeem ra. Sagi beshu do rangiye ummeed bhi mura. Harfe faribe Adamo Iblis tabicham. Faribe harfe faribe Adamo Iblis tabicham. Chandi babu tarane nuklo nadeem ra. Chandi bagu tarane nuklo nadeem ra. Sagi beshu do rangiye ummeed bhi mura. Bue nabiz khalwate shabha shunidi. Bue nabiz khalwate shabha shunidi. Pinhan makun Kinikshana shamim ra. Pinhan makun Kinikshana shamim ra. Sagi beshu do rangiye ummeed bhi mura. Jinsi ke dar khazine lutfe to neest neest. Jinsi ke dar khazine lutfe to neest neest. Juzaitiyaj tofe nadidam kareem ra. Juzaitiyaj tofe nadidam kareem ra. Sagi beshu do rangiye ummeed bhi mura. Ruzi ke jurmname naziri barawara. Ruzi ke jurmname naziri barawara. Azab afshui kitabe sagheem ra. Sagi beshu do rangiye ummeed bhi mura. Benuma bema haqiqate रंगे कदीम रा साकी बिशू दुरंगिए उम्मीद बीम रा। थैंक्स।
Thank you so much. Now I would like to invite Professor Bilqis Fatma Hussaini, Honorary Secretary of the Society, to deliver the vote of thanks and formally close today's session.
Salam adab. With the permission of Professor Hassan, I want to thank each of us. First of all, I have to thank Ms. Ira Mohti. She has presented a very scholarly paper and I am very thankful to her. She has honored our society by presenting such a scholarly paper. I am very thankful to you. बस मैं जनाब फरहत साहब का, प्रोफेसर फरहत हसन साहब का शुक्रिया अदा करती हूँ कि उन्होंने इसको कबूल किया और हम लोगों के लिए बाइस से शरफ़ व इज़्ज़त है कि आप यहाँ तशरीफ़ लाए और आपने अपने मशवरे से हम लोगों को आगाह किया। उसके बाद मैं चाहती हूँ कि अपने अज़ीज़ फ़रीद असर साहब का शुक्रिया अदा करूँ। जनाब आक़ाई फ़रीद असर वाक़ई मन खैली मुतशक्किरम कि शुमा हमेशा बामा कुमत कंीद व हमेशा इन ताउन के मादारी में हमें चीज़ा आज तरफ शुमाज अव्वलीन सुखनदानी अव्वलीन जलसे दर जाकिर हुसैन कॉलेज बुदे दानिशकदे जाकिर हुसैन बाद 9 जलसे माँ इंजा दारी व इन बाइस से इफ्तिखार माँ हम हर सब बाइस से इफ्तिखार इन खाने फरहंग हस्त के इन हमेशा बराए एक उस्ताद के माऊरा ज़बान फ़ारसी व ज़बान उर्दू बाबा ये उर्दू निगे प्रोफेसर आबिदी वाक़यान एक मर्द नो अंदीश बुदे वो बसियार बराए तरोीज ज़बान व अदब फ़ारसी हमेशा कुशान बुद वनी ख़ास के अदबियात हिंदो ईरान यानी इंडो पर्शियन लिटरेचर इसके ऊपर उन्होंने अपनी पूरी ज़िंदगी में बहुत काम किया और हर एक को उन्होंने इस पर आमादा किया कि जो आने वाली नस्लें हैं वो ये फरामोश न करें कि हिंदुस्तान में फ़ारसी अदब की क्या क्या खिदमात हुई हैं। मैं इस वक्त अपने उन बच्चों को जो यहाँ मौजूद हैं जो फ़ारसी के स्कॉलर्स हैं उनके लिए ये कहूँ कि प्रोफेसर आबिदी अरे इन मर्दी इनक़द बुज़ुर्ग बुदे वाक़यान अज़ लिहाज़ अख़लाक़ अज़ लिहाज़ इल्म व दानिश व हुनर इनक़द मर्द बुज़ुर्ग बुदे व मुनकसिर यानी उनके इनकसार का आलम ये था कि वो एक छोटे काम करने वाले क्लीनर स्वीपर इन सबको कंधों पर हाथ रखकर उनके अहवाल पुरसी करते थे। उन्होंने कभी अपने इल्म का पैराहन ओढ़ा नहीं बल्कि फ़िक्र व ज़हन में इल्म को रखा और इसको इस तरह हम लोगों के दिलों में डाला कि हम लोग आज इस लायक उन्हीं के अता से हैं। मैं उनकी इस फ़िक्र को जो उन्होंने हम लोगों के दरमियान छोड़ा मैं बच्चाए अज़ीज़ दानिशजुयान गिरामी तो खिदमत शुमा अज़ीज़ान मानिए चंद बैत अज़ शायर बुजुर्ग ईरान साये में खुनम के वालुम बेशे के वाक़यान इन एहसास दरूनी प्रोफेसर आबिदी است که به ما گفته شده است انتقال میکنم به شما زمان به دست شما میدهد زمام مراد زمان به دست شما میدهد زمان مراد از آنکه هست به دست خرد زمان شما تمام نمیخونم فقط 3-4 بیت رو میخونم زمان قره نو میزند به نام شما خوشا شما که جهان میرود به کام شما در این هوا چه نفسها پر آتش است و خوش است که بوی عود دل ماست در مشام شما یعنی این بیتی را که من میخونم بعدا این واقعا مخصوص افکار پروفسور عابدی تنور سینه سوزان ما به یاد آرید تنور سینه سوزان ما به یاد آرید کزاتش دل ما پخت گشت خام شما کزاتش دل ما پخت گشت خام شما فروغ گوهری از گنج خانه دل ماست چراغ صبح کے برمی دہد زبان شما میں ان تمام حضرات کا جو اس جلسے میں آئے صمیم قلب کے ساتھ شکریہ ادا کرتی ہوں پروفیسر ایرا مکھوٹے کا پروفیسر حسن صاحب کا خانہ فرہنگ میں آغاز قہرمان سلیمانی کے مدیر مرکز تحقیقات ہیں اور اعظم صاحب کا تو میں شکریہ ادا ہی نہیں کر سکتی کہ وہ کس انداز سے ہم لوگوں کے ساتھ تعاون اپنا پیش کرتے ہیں بہت بہت شکریہ تمام حاضرین کا
Thank you so much, ma'am.
ایک ضروری باتیں کہنی تھی جو معاف کیجیے گا یہ کہ پروفیسر ڈاکٹر شاہد مہدی صاحب علیل ہیں اس وجہ سے وہ نہیں آئے لیکن میں ان کی بھی شکر گزار ہوں کہ انہوں نے جس اپنے دل جمی کے ساتھ ہم لوگوں کے ساتھ کام کیا ہے ہم اس کو فراموش نہیں کر سکتے اور آج وہ نہیں آ سکے ہیں ہم سب کا شکریہ ادا کرتے ہیں چندر شیکھر صاحب نے بھی اپنے اس میں آ کر کے ہم لوگوں کے ساتھ ہمیشہ یہ کام کرتے رہتے ہیں ان کا بھی شکریہ اخلاق صاحب بھی آج آنے والے تھے لیکن میں ان کی طبیعت خراب ہو گئی اور اس وجہ سے وہ نہیں آ سکے شکر گزار ہوں کہ انہوں نے تعاون کیا اور JNU میں اپنے بچوں کو اس کا آنے کے لیے یہاں انہوں نے آمادگی کا اظہار کیا بہت بہت شکریہ خدا حافظ
Thank you so much, ma'am. من از این شعر این برنامه رو کاملا تمام میکنم این حکایت را که نقد وقت ماست گر تمامش میکنی اینجا رواست